At first glance, dopamine might seem like the brain's pleasure chemical, the molecule behind our enjoyment of food, music, or social interaction. But neuroscience reveals a far deeper and more fascinating role. Dopamine is not just about feeling good, it is about seeking, striving, and learning. It plays a central role in how we anticipate rewards, make decisions, and adapt our behavior based on experience. In fact, without dopamine, motivation itself begins to collapse. So, how does this single molecule orchestrate something as complex as learning and drive? It all starts with how the brain tracks reward prediction error, the difference between what you expect and what actually happens. When something turns out better than predicted, dopamine neurons in areas like the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and substantia nigra fire a burst of activity. This dopamine surge strengthens the neural pathways that led to the positive outcome. When the result is worse than expected, those same neurons reduce their activity, weakening those connections. This constant recalibration is how the brain learns what to pursue and what to avoid. Think of it as your brain's internal feedback system. When dopamine neurons register a positive surprise, they reinforce the behaviors that caused it. That is why gambling can be addictive. Intermittent, unpredictable rewards cause frequent dopamine spikes. This system operates largely beneath conscious awareness, subtly shaping habits, preferences, and even personality over time. But dopamine's influence does not end with pleasure or error tracking. It also governs goal-directed behavior. When you are hungry and smell food, dopamine levels rise. Not because you have eaten, but because your brain expects a reward. This motivational signal helps initiate action. It prepares the motor system, engages attention, and focuses working memory, all necessary to achieve the desired outcome. In this way, dopamine acts as a neuromodulatory bridge between motivation and action. In learning environments, this mechanism becomes especially powerful. Functional MRI studies show that dopamine-rich areas of the brain, such as the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex, light up not just when students get answers right, but when they are about to learn something new. Curiosity itself may be fueled by dopamine, as it drives exploration and effort even before external rewards appear. Consider students tackling a difficult math problem. When they finally solve it, a dopamine surge not only brings satisfaction, it reinforces the mental strategies that led to success. Over time, this neurochemical pattern builds lasting skills. Similarly, in animals, experiments show that dopamine helps link specific environmental cues to actions and outcomes, an essential process in operant conditioning. It is the biological foundation of trial and error learning. What brain regions are most involved? The mesolimbic dopamine pathway, running from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens, is central to reward and motivation. The mesocortical pathway, projecting to the prefrontal cortex, supports attention, planning, and working memory. The nigrostriatal pathway, which connects the substantia nigra to the striatum, is key for habit formation and motor learning. Together, these circuits ensure that dopamine modulates not just pleasure, but cognition, movement, and decision-making. How important is dopamine in real-world behavior? Consider what happens when it is deficient. In Parkinson's disease, where dopamine-producing neurons deteriorate, patients struggle with movement. But they also lose drive. Everyday tasks become emotionally flat and physically draining. In contrast, dopamine-enhancing drugs used to treat ADHD and narcolepsy often improve motivation and learning by boosting signal transmission in key brain circuits. Dopamine's influence also extends into creativity, innovation, and resilience. When people engage in tasks with uncertain outcomes, like scientific discovery or artistic exploration, dopaminergic systems keep them curious, persistent, and responsive to feedback. This helps explain why some individuals thrive in complex environments that require adaptive learning and sustained effort. But dopamine is not all reward and success. It can also drive maladaptive behaviors. Addictions, compulsions, and risk-taking often hijack the dopamine system. When artificial or extreme rewards, like drugs or social media, produce surges of dopamine without effort or uncertainty, they short circuit the natural learning process. The result is reinforcement of unhealthy patterns at the expense of meaningful learning. Emerging technologies, from real time fMRI neurofeedback to pharmacological interventions, are beginning to target dopamine circuits more precisely. These tools aim to enhance learning, treat psychiatric disorders, or optimize motivation in personalized ways. Artificial intelligence models of reinforcement learning, heavily inspired by dopamine biology, are already transforming robotics and decision science. Ultimately, dopamine is not just a pleasure molecule. It is the chemical pulse of wanting, acting, and growing. It guides us toward goals, teaches us from experience, and shapes who we become. Could understanding dopamine unlock new pathways to motivation, recovery, and peak performance? The growing body of research suggests it just might. Dopamine is a neuromodulator produced primarily by neurons in the ventral tegmental area, NVTA, and substantia nigra that regulates neural excitability and synaptic plasticity. It does not directly encode pleasure, but instead signals the salience and expected value of stimuli, influencing decision-making circuits. Dopamine release alters the strength of synaptic connections, making certain neural pathways more likely to activate in the future. These modulatory effects enable dopamine to shape both moment-to-moment motivation and longer-term learning. Example, a burst of dopamine fires in anticipation of receiving a favorite snack, energizing approach behaviors. Analogy, dopamine acts like a volume knob on brain circuits, turning up the gain on important signals so they stand out. Dopamine neurons encode reward prediction errors, the difference between expected and actual outcomes, by increasing firing when outcomes exceed expectations and decreasing firing when they fall short. Positive prediction errors reinforce the behaviors and cues that led to unexpected rewards, while negative errors weaken associations when outcomes disappoint. This dynamic updating mechanism allows organisms to adjust their expectations and actions based on experience. Over repeated trials, prediction errors diminish as expectations align with reality, stabilizing learned behaviors. Example, a student studying randomly rewarded quiz questions learns which topics most reliably yield correct answers. Analogy, reward prediction error is like adjusting a thermostat. If it's too cold, the heater turns up. If it's too hot, it turns down. Dopamine release energizes effortful behavior by biasing decision circuits toward actions that promise higher expected value. Higher tonic dopamine levels increase willingness to exert effort for rewards, whereas low levels promote passivity and avoidance of demanding tasks. By modulating cost-benefit computations in the prefrontal cortex and striatum, dopamine determines how hard we work to achieve goals. Thus, dopamine underlies the drive component of motivation rather than simply mediating pleasure. Example, rats with elevated dopamine will climb a barrier to reach a preferred food rather than settling for freely available but less tasty chow. Analogy, dopamine is like a fuel gauge, higher levels fill the tank, enabling longer drives toward distant goals. In reinforcement learning models, dopamine signals serve as teaching signals that update value estimates and policy selection in corticostriatal circuits. These updates strengthen synaptic weights for actions leading to positive outcomes and weaken those for negative or unrewarding ones. Over time, the brain builds an internal model of action-outcome contingencies, optimizing behavior to maximize rewards. This neural learning parallels machine learning algorithms that adjust parameters based on feedback. Example, gamers quickly learn which joystick moves produce successful in-game outcomes, guided by dopamine-mediated reinforcement. Analogy, dopamine acts like a feedback lamp on a control panel. Green flashes reinforce correct moves. Red dimming discourages errors. The mesolimbic pathway, VTA, nucleus accumbens, mediates reward valuation and motivation, while the mesocortical pathway, VTA, prefrontal cortex, supports planning and decision-making. Dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens energizes approach behaviors, whereas release in prefrontal regions updates goal representations and action strategies. Balanced activity across both pathways ensures adaptive pursuit of rewards without impulsivity or indecision. Dysregulation of either circuit disrupts motivation and learning. Example: anticipation of a bonus triggers nucleus accumbens dopamine release, while prefrontal dopamine refines the strategy to earn it. Analogy: these pathways are like the accelerator, mesolimbic, and steering wheel, mesocortical, of a car. Both must work together to reach a destination efficiently. With repeated reinforcement, dopamine mediated learning shifts control from goal directed circuits to habitual circuits in the dorsal striatum. This transition reduces cognitive load by automating frequently performed actions, freeing mental resources for new tasks. Habitual behaviors become less sensitive to outcome devaluation, reflecting strengthened stimulus response associations. Dopamine levels modulate the speed and persistence of this shift toward habit. Example: after weeks of driving the same route, commuters navigate home with little conscious effort. Analogy: habit formation via dopamine is like programming autopilot. You set the route once, and it runs automatically thereafter. Deficits in dopamine signaling lead to motivational impairments such as inertia, apathy, and depression, while excess signaling can contribute to compulsivity and addiction. In Parkinson's disease, loss of dopamine neurons causes profound difficulty initiating movement and diminished reward sensitivity. Conversely, addictive substances hijack dopamine circuits, reinforcing maladaptive behaviors. Understanding dopamine dysfunction informs treatments that restore balanced motivational drive. Example: Parkinson's patients on L-Dopa experience improved motivation and movement initiation as dopamine levels rise. Analogy: dopamine dysfunction is like a malfunctioning thermostat. Too low, and the system shuts down. Too high, and it overheats. Novelty, unpredictability, and social feedback amplify dopamine release, enhancing motivation and learning under stimulating conditions. Conversely, chronic stress and monotony reduce dopamine tone, leading to disengagement and cognitive fatigue. Structured variability, such as spaced rewards or changing tasks, optimizes dopamine dynamics for sustained engagement. Designing learning environments that harness these modulatory effects boosts retention and performance. Example: gamified learning platforms use unpredictable rewards and social leaderboards to sustain dopamine-driven engagement. Analogy: dopamine modulation by environment is like adjusting lighting in a room. Bright, varied lights energize. Techniques such as goal setting, immediate feedback, and progressive challenges leverage dopamine's role in reinforcement to optimize skill acquisition. Mindful use of rewards, both intrinsic and extrinsic points, promotes durable learning without fostering dependency. Neurofeedback and adaptive tutoring systems can monitor and adjust tasks in real time to maintain optimal dopamine-driven motivation. Harnessing these principles can transform education, workplace training, and rehabilitation into more effective, personalized experiences. Example: language learning apps that provide instant corrective feedback and streak bonuses keep learners motivated and progressing rapidly. Analogy: effective learning design is like tuning a musical instrument. Small adjustments in feedback and challenge keep the brain in perfect motivational harmony.